All right. Hello, everyone. Happy New Year. Welcome to CS Research Week. Believe it or not, this is the 7th CS Research Week that we are organizing here. I'm very happy. We have an excellent program. Thanks to the distinguished speakers who agreed to come and join us for this event, and also the colleagues who helped us identify the speakers and hosting them during this time. The event would be a 3-day event as usual, and I look forward to all the excellent talks and interactions with the speakers during this time. So as for the first talk, it's my great pleasure to introduce Professor Tom Ristenpart. Tom is a very good friend and a mentor. I've known Tom for a long time because of his very influential papers, but specifically when I moved to Cornell Tech to do my postdoc, he was there, and we spent quite some time there discussing a lot of interesting problems on security and privacy in machine learning. Tom has pioneered many interesting research directions in security and applied crypto. Has received, I don't know how many, 3-4 Test of Time awards, which shows the impact of his work, and numerous Best Paper awards for different areas of computer security, from applied crypto, side channel attacks, and so on and so forth. So I look forward to your talk, Tom. Thanks a lot for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, thanks for the wonderful introduction. So today I'm going to talk about some of our work that I've started kind of thinking of as computer security and known adversary threat models. If we kind of start at the very beginning of computer security, this is this fascinating area from my perspective, and why I've been so excited to pursue it throughout my career, where we need to study the behavior and functionality and efficacy of computing systems in the presence of adversaries. So what underlies most of computer security is thinking about threat models, right? Who is the adversary? Who is this nefarious person who's trying to cause problems? What are they trying to do? And what are their capabilities? Now, when we think about computer security, we imagine lots of different typical types of things. I don't know, can we make this interactive too? Or? So what's a typical computer security adversary that people think of? Anyone? Is it too early and jet lagged for interaction? What was that? Someone from the back? Bomb? Bob. No, you're thinking of Eve, I think, not Bob. Eve was the evil one, right? Poor Eve. Okay, well, when I think of computer security adversaries, and if you Google, you get something, and I actually Googled this with the Bing image, so that's Microsoft Binged it with the Bing image generator. We think of some nefarious stranger on the internet causing problems, right? Maybe it's a lone wolf hacktivist, but more likely, if you're working in computer security, you're thinking of kind of institutional threat actors, right? And so our threat model since, basically the dawn of computer security which sprang out of the military and intelligence ecosystems, and then turned into the corporate ecosystems later, thinking about the compromise of digital systems, by well-resourced and sophisticated attackers, such as governments, cybercriminals, hacktivists. Okay, so there's lots of examples of these. Some recent, like old ones are Stuxnet, kind of government operations. More recently, the big news in the U.S. was concern about Chinese compromise of the telecom backbones. And then we have tons of great information if you're interested in like cybercrime. This is all very U.S.-centric. I apologize for that, but that's where I have good references. You can look at the Internet Crime Report, which talks about cybercrime. In contrast, we've been doing a lot of thinking and look at what many people call interpersonal tech abuse, which is just this kind of immense challenge that I think is only last decade or so started to be recognized. We collaborated with Google a few years ago, and they ran a global survey, to ask people about their experiences online with things like online bullying, stalking, account compromised by someone they know, and almost 1/2 of respondents said that they had issues in the past year with this, and there was an increase year over year. I co-run a clinic, the Clinic to End Neck Abuse, which I'll talk about more later in the talk, which gets about 20 people referred per month to get help with intimate partner violence, also known as domestic violence tech abuse. So these are big problems, and actually it's like something I think the computer security community has not paid a lot of attention to. And in contrast to our traditional threat models of the last many decades, there's a big difference, right? These are people who are known to the victim, right, and are in their social circles. Either it's an intimate partner, another family person, acquaintance, etc. And so we have this big gap, I think, between many of the traditional things that we've been focusing on, including myself, over the many years in computer security, thinking about digital systems against these kind of stranger danger online, and these kind of known adversary threat models. So what I'm going to try and do today is convince you a bit that this is a topic area that's kind of very important that we should be spending a lot more time thinking about, because this is the source of a lot of harm that people are experiencing vis-a-vis technology. And I think one thing to keep in mind, and I like to think of as a shift in perspective that behooves us as we think about how to think about computer security and these known adversary threat models, is we need to think a little bit about shifting from just protecting technology itself to mitigating technology-based harms to people, right? Obviously, the technology is playing a role in that. Okay, so for today's talk, I'm going to talk about intimate partner violence and tech abuse. This is where this perspective of mine has grown out of the last 10 years of work, almost 10 years of work. I'll talk about our work at CETA and this kind of notion of like doing tech abuse clinics, and then how that informs in the second half, we'll see where the half lies, but how we rethink computer security mechanisms and need to revisit them in light of these known adversary threat models. Okay, so just as a brief one, I'm going to be talking about intimate partner violence. It's not the most pleasant subject always, and so there's going to be some discussion of physical and sexual and emotional violence. So just have a heads up so it's not shocking coming right up on the next slide. So IPV is this gigantic problem, something when I first started working in this space I didn't know much about, but was shocked to realize the statistics. The best stats we have about this are very US-centric. The US CDC did some phone screen surveys, and about 1 out of 4 women and 1 out of 10 men, and about half of non-binary people have reported experiencing sexual violence, contact sexual violence, physical violence, or stalking by an intimate partner, which has had negative impacts on their lives, right? So severe repercussions. So we think of IPV and what used to be called domestic violence, but now is more talked about as IPV since you may not be living together. We think of that as like physical, maybe sexual assault, but actually it's much more about power and control. I think one of the better theories from the ecosystem of experts working on these problems, talks about as coercive control, right? It's a pattern of behaviors used by one partner to maintain power and control over another, and they accrue benefits from that power asymmetry. And so from that lens, it may not be super surprising that when you think about what role technology is playing in these IPV situations, it's playing a very often negative role, and there'd been a lot of prior work even before we started kind of pointing out the ways in which abusers were, unfortunately but cleverly perhaps, taking advantage of technology to exert coercive control tactics over their partner. In terms of, we don't have a lot of good quantitative data on the incidence rates of tech abuse within IPV, but of the studies that have been shown, it looks very prevalent, 73% in this particular study of just college students. And anecdotally, in our work with domestic violence and IPV survivors, we see it almost all the time, in almost every case. Okay, so we're interested to understand and dig deeper into this ecosystem, and we're very fortunate to be working in New York City, which has a relatively well-provisioned survivor support ecosystem. The New York City Mayor's Office to End Domestic and Gender-Based Violence is this municipal organization that is tasked with running, among other things, running the family justice centers, which there's one in each neighborhood in New York City, and they're tasked with being kind of a one-stop shop for getting assistance with domestic violence or IPV problems. So you can go there to get legal representation, to get mental health resources, housing, if you need to remove yourself physically from the situation, et cetera. Being New York City, and given the incidence rates we saw before, I mean, the scale, sadly, is large, right, in terms of the number of client visits to an FJC, This is a NYPD has a checkbox on their incident response form which says, was it a domestic violence incident? And so there's over 100,000 domestic violence incidents per year. So the scale is very large. But these are really nice ecosystems for doing research as well as getting access to better understanding of the ecosystem here. And so we were able to collaborate with New York City Mayor's Office and NGBV to do some initial kind of studies. This is back in like the 2016, 2017 time period. So we did a qualitative study in which we interviewed professionals from the ecosystem to ask them about questions about like how is technology playing a role in your clients' experiences. And we were also able to run some focus groups at the suggestion of the professionals. They suggested doing focus groups with survivors of intimate partner violence. Same set of questions asking about technology issues. It was really inspiring, actually, to meet with many of the survivors. They were very eager, in many cases, to talk about their experience in the hopes that it would help us get informed about how we might improve outcomes for technology abuse. And so I like to let the survivors kind of speak for themselves, and so I'm just going to read a kind of snippet of a quote from one of the survivors in the focus groups. I was raised in a country in which women are trained to serve men. I'll say that he never hit me, basically, but he did the worst thing ever. Honestly, I would probably rather that he hit me instead of the things that he did to me. So he put a spyware in our computer. Obviously, I didn't know because he studied computer programming, so he was very savvy about it. He went into my computer, he got my Facebook password, email password, and he shared naked pictures of me. He sent them from his Facebook to my bosses. He took my phone and he sent them through private messages to several friends, but also through my email and my Facebook because he had the password. The embarrassment that I went through, the public humiliation, it beat me to the ground. So just in this one participant's story, and this is just a snippet of the story, we see lots of ways in which technology is being weaponized against them. So talking about spyware being put on the computer, using ownership of the computer to like install monitoring programs, account compromise, what's in the industry here we call non-consensual intimate imagery, so sharing intimate images without consent, device compromise, and impersonation online. So not every story, of course, was this involved, but many were, kind of a surprisingly number of them. And across all of these in aggregate, we were able to kind of step back and kind of provide a very high-level sort of taxonomy of the types of tech abuse issues that we were seeing participants relay. One is this idea of ownership-based. Because of the social relationship, many of the abusers were actually the ones who set up the technology in the first place, right? Set up accounts for the victim, owned or set up the Wi-Fi network at home or computers, et cetera. That kind of trivially gives them access to exploit them. Even when they don't own the device to set them up, they can compromise accounts, right? For example, or get access and compel disclosure of PIN numbers to allow, or nowadays, fingerprints to get into devices. There's a whole set of attacks that are just kind of harassment online. Social media played a big role in this. So you hear about stories where calling or texting hundreds of times a day, or like in the middle of the night to try and keep people up. Using proxy harassment, so basically getting mutual acquaintances, like friends or a new girlfriend or whatever, to also harass the target. And then exposure to private information. This is like the non-consensual intimate images. You hear about stories, unfortunate stories about like setting up fake dating profiles as if it were the victim, but the abuser's the one actually setting it up and then sending dates to the home of the victim, et cetera. So in aggregate, it was very complicated in the sense that technology is being exploited in many, many different ways to cause harm. And then even in individual cases, right, it's something to keep in mind, in individual cases, it's multimodal in terms of what tech abuse is going on. And in fact, in that story, like these are just the highlights of the ones that were in that snippet, but that story kind of goes on, and there was a bunch of other problems that the survivor relayed in terms of issues. Okay, so we have this landscape of IPV tech abuse that we're able to glean from direct reports, that's widespread, damaging, and complicated, even in individual cases. Most often, what we heard about is technologically simple attacks, right? It's not the type of thing we think about with traditional computer security of like hacking and, well, people use the term hacking, but like, remote compromise and software exploitation. In fact, most things are what we like to refer to as UI-bound adversaries, right? These are, abusers who sit down and use a device or an app in the same way other people do, more or less, but just to cause harm, right? Reconfiguring it to like share location or just logging in and looking at the emails on Gmail because you have, of the victim's Gmail because you have access. In many cases, we heard a lot about dual-use software and devices. Well, that wasn't what Survivor said. That's the jargon we use for it, which just means tools that are set up for one purpose that's so normatively valuable, but repurposed for others. So, for example, when AirTags came out, which was a little bit after this, when AirTags came out, we immediately started seeing, of course, these used for stalking in our clinic and many other things as well. And then something that was very frequently concerned about, particularly in those early studies, is like kind of this consumer-grade spyware, or what came to be known as stalkerware, like apps that are built for monitoring and control purposes and to be covert that you can install on devices. Okay. Yeah. So just to bring back a little bit to this threat model gap between the kind of conventional and IPV kind of known adversary threat model, some of our mechanisms aren't working well, and hopefully at this point now, maybe for somewhat obvious reasons, but conventionally we think of things like passwords and authentication as helping keep out strangers online from your accounts, right? They're connecting from other places, etc. In this IPV context, it's different, right? You have an incident maybe living with that person. They may be using the same devices. They may know or have can compel disclosure of passwords, etc. And so this really changes as we see a lot in practice, the efficacy of our security mechanisms, right? And we'll have to rethink this, which I'll come back to later. It's not just account compromise and this thing. There's lots of examples from these early papers where we saw that things that you might use to detect, say, commercial fraud or spam just aren't going to work well here, right? It could be very personalized in terms of the toxic, harassing message, right? Hear stories about people trying to report things like, oh, this person sent a picture of a gun to me, right? And, at least in Facebook in the US, having a picture of a gun is totally fine by the site policies, but that means something very specific and threatening to the victim. And at risk of belaboring point, all this ends up, not the attacks may be in general not very technically sophisticated, but it doesn't mean it's not complicated, right? The social circumstances of the abuse and the tech abuse make things, one, you get all this access, but two, there's all these other complexities that get brought in too as we try to think about mitigations, and we'll want to keep this in mind as well. So, for example, one thing we heard a lot about is escalation risk, right? Actually for some survivors, it may not be wise to uninstall that spyware because that could trigger an escalation of physical violence or confrontation, right? And in fact, they'd rather know that the spyware is there and can behave accordingly until they feel like they're in a safer place. And just more broadly, survivor goals can vary widely, right, depending on the situation. Okay, so this initial set of studies kind of kicked off a bit of a research and advocacy journey, and then I'm just going to describe in sort of and kind of take you through it. And we're not going to go into detail on all these things. Don't worry, I'm not going to take all of lunch from you. But we basically started by looking a bit more at spyware. That's something we thought as computer security people that I understand malware, roughly. It's something we talk about in computer security a lot. Maybe we can understand that. And then talk about this clinical work that we've been doing. And then the latter part, we'll talk about how we've revisited some mechanism design to try to understand how to kind of improve security outcomes in these known adversary threat models. Okay. So this spyware problem is something we heard about a lot, right? There's a quote from a case manager about a situation where a survivor had been tracked down physically to one of their offices, and they believe it was because of some third-party application that was installed on the device. And indeed, if you Google around online for how to track my partner, you will get an ecosystem, kind of a village, cottage industry, that's the right term, of companies that are kind of marketing to IPV abusers their kind of tools, right? So we were very interested in studying this ecosystem. And so back in 2018, we did this, we basically combined some open web search, which most of the most egregious kind of marketing and products were on the open web, but we also crawled the Google and Apple Play Store to try to find things that we thought might be IPV relevant, right? So we used a little bit of lightweight machine learning and hand labeling to classify these things as potentially relevant. And even on the app stores, we found thousands of apps. And part of this is because we were pretty liberal about marking things as IPv relevant, and that's because of dual-use apps. This is kind of fun exchange with the grad student at the time where I was like, that can't possibly be an IPv relevant app, this thing you showed me. And then he would point to a blog post online suggesting, in fact, people have been weaponizing it for IPv. That's just one example of that. This is a quote from a forum online where someone is asking for help setting up a app on their wife's phone, so it's hidden, and they can do location tracking. And some helpful person replied on this forum saying, hey, why don't you install this thing called Cerberus from the Play Store, which at the time, Cerberus was something on the official Play Store. It's marketed as an anti-theft app, right? Something that you would install on your own device to be able to track it covertly when it gets stolen. But as the helpful, quote-unquote, poster points out, it has all the nice features that you might want in stalking your wife, right? And so this is what we talk about as a quintessential dual-use app. We have no evidence that the designer of Cerberus was actually trying to advertise, make it useful for abuse, but it happens to be. Okay, so at the time we did some work. We talked to Google about this and Apple, and they took down a bunch of apps, strengthened policies, and then we switched gears for a little while and worked with Norton-LifeLock, which is an antivirus company, to try to get at least the AV companies to start flagging IPv spyware as something that should be just flagging it at all, and then there's some questions about how to communicate what it's doing to users. Because before our work, no one had been flagging these things, right? If you run antivirus scan, it's not a malicious software. Why? Because they're looking for more traditional types of malware. And subsequently, this has become more the common view. I think that this should be something that's flagged by antivirus. Okay, so good. Okay, so we had done this work on IPv spyware ecosystem and had this list actually of, we knew about all these different spyware apps that were marketed or could be used for harm. And so we had this idea hey, sitting around the office saying, hey, what would be great to do as a follow-up study? We also have access to the Family Justice Center systems. Why don't we just do this research cool measurement study where we build an IPv spyware detection tool. We can go recruit survivors, scan their devices, and then we can figure out the instance rates of these IPv spywars in practice for survivors, right, as a kind of a quantitative study. Seemed like a really cool idea, but then we immediately started thinking a little bit more carefully and critically about what we were suggesting to do there, and we had to slow down and think about this a bit more. The reason this is a kind of a fraught research study idea was we had already heard from our own research that many of the survivors, they're called clients in the context of FGCs, the clients, wanted help with many, many types of tech abuse. And actually, a lot of our focus groups, even though we kept saying hey, we're here to learn from you about your situations, we're not here to give you advice, we don't know enough about your situations to give advice about what you should do. The desire for expert help with the tech abuse was palpable, and they kept asking us and peppering us with questions about various issues that they were facing. So combine that with the extreme potential safety risks, right? What do we do if we detect spyware, right? What do we say? Oh, thanks, that's helpful for our study. Have a nice day. Not a great way of handling the situation because of threats like escalation. And then kind of more systemic things, if we start going in and offering tools like spyware scanning to this ecosystem of at-risk population, right? That's going to have an indelible impact on the ecosystem, right? People will hear about it, they'll want to get access to these tools, et cetera. So this is kind of symptomatic of similar issues that are well known in many research areas in computer science and other areas of helicopter research. You kind of helicopter in and then helicopter out and not really make the ecosystem any better, right? Even though you got your Nature science paper. As a side point, we've done some work trying to systematize our understanding of how to do research of this ilk, and in particular with what has come to be started calling at-risk populations in the computer security ecosystem. Those are groups who are disproportionately likely to be suffering tech abuse or may suffer disproportionate harms should they suffer from tech abuse. And basically the high-level takeaway is you should really be treating research always as an intervention, meaning that you expect that you're going to be changing what's going on whenever you do your research. And that's even true if you're doing like online measurement studies and stuff. Maybe the burden of how to react to that perspective is lower, but still important to keep. And then we gave some strategies about how to like do this a bit more safely based on our, plus a bunch of other research, a lot of research involved in this paper, perspectives. Okay, so we followed that kind of viewpoint and started thinking about, okay, actually, if we're going to do this measurement type study, let's start from scratch. Let's think about designing this as an intervention, right? Where we're basically going to meet with a client who gets referred to us from the FJC system, and they're going to have some broad tech abuse kind of issues. And we want to basically have our researcher / now what we started calling tech consultant, right? Be someone who's aware and trained about the nuances of this population, knows how to do trauma-informed kind of client-centered care, and can work with them to try to address as best they can whatever the tech abuse problems are that the survivor's facing. We can additionally offer to scan their device for spyware, which we did build a tool for that. But that's just one component, and we try to help them as best we can while we're doing our research study. Okay, of course, this didn't exist before us, and in fact, some of the early work I didn't really talk about, but was asking a lot about this to the support ecosystem about the state of tech abuse support. And the uniform answer was like, we need more. There really isn't any. We do best effort, social workers doing best effort on tech abuse support. So this didn't really exist. So we had to go through this kind of iterative design process to try to figure out what's it going to look like when you sit down physically at the time with a survivor to try to help them with tech abuse. And so what we did, and this is back in summer 2018, is focus groups with professionals, right? So we gathered a panel of professionals, present to them an idea for what we're going to do, literally like what are we going to say, how are we going to proceed, what will we do if something comes up, et cetera, and then get feedback from these professionals about what they thought as experts. These are social workers, police, lawyers, and others who are working with survivors on other aspects to understand how we should improve and iterate on our research protocol. We did that 14 focus groups iteratively until we kind of got to the point where we weren't really getting substantive feedback anymore. And then we went through an approval process with the NGBV leadership and their legal teams and everything to get approval. And then we went ahead and did a pilot study in 2018, 2019, met with, at the time, 44 clients and scanned 105 devices. And basically, we never stopped, actually. So this is what evolved in the Clinic 10 tech abuse, which I'll mention again in a second. Just briefly, like, what was the output of this 14 iterations was this consultation protocol where we get a referral. It's a referral-based system. So we're getting a referral from a professional who's already working with the client. We sit down with them and go through kind of a high-level structured interaction where we try to understand what's going on, what are their chief concerns, like what are they actually trying to get help with, what devices and accounts are relevant, which is actually super complicated. If you think about your own like footprint of digital stuff, and then think about, you need to worry about how someone got pictures that you took, right? It gets really complicated very quickly. There may be children involved as well, et cetera. And then we do some investigation. We scan their devices if they want. We'll scan their devices for the spyware, do some manual investigation of accounts, et cetera. And then we provide some information. We're there to provide information so they can decide what's best for them to do in that situation. This is the notion of client-centered care, right? We're not there to tell them what to do. We're there to provide them information. So in that first trial study, we met with 44 clients. We found a few clients had potential spyware, not very many. There's one jailbroken device, that older Apple phone that was jailbroken. Many potential password compromise, kind of like account compromise situations, unwanted logins, et cetera. Lots of shared family phone plans. We see this a lot, et cetera. And in a lot of cases, we weren't able to help them find anything, right? In which case, some clients did not appreciate that. Many did. It depends on whether they're looking for a clean explanation for their situation. So we basically never stopped running this, right? We basically segued into becoming a client service provider as part of our kind of commitment not to do helicopter research. And this evolved into, we came up with a name and a logo and stuff at some point, Clinic 10 Tech Abuse, which is a free clinic that we've been operating since 2018 in New York City. We basically get volunteers, train them to do this role of tech consultant, and then have a small cadre of clinic coordinators now, including myself, who also meet with clients. And have worked with hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of clients now. We get about 200 referrals a year, and that's mostly constrained by our capacity, right? If we could scale more, then we would have more referrals. New York City's been very happy with this, and GBV and our other partners have given us much positive feedback. The other thing, from a research perspective, that's been helpful is we can instrument this clinic, right? So we basically ask clients, and this is always a little delicate because we want to not be extractive, but we carefully ask clients like if they want to participate in research. If they say yes, we then ask if they mind us recording the conversation. They can say no to anything, of course, and we proceed as we would anyway with the consultation. But for those that do, and many are actually, as I mentioned before, eager to like help out with improving outcomes in these cases, we get a lot of data, kind of unique data about tech abuse and IPV. And so this has enabled us to kind of start thinking about tech abuse interventions themselves as an object of study, right? We had this initial paper like laying out the idea, but maybe we didn't get everything right perfectly, or we can improve on it, as we gain more experience over the years. And so we've done the sequence of papers and projects where we basically kind of think about new ways of doing the intervention design and deployment, or usually relatively small tweaks to what we're doing, but we want to diligently analyze the impact of those things as best we can. And so we've evolved the ecosystem. So for example, when COVID-19 came, we had to go remote, right? Because we couldn't meet in person anymore. That has some interesting complexities because we're meeting with people who think they're being monitored often by their technology, right? And so we had to navigate that challenge. Now we have kind of a longer-term care model where we can meet multiple times with clients. Previously, it was all anonymous and just one-off, and et cetera. I'll just talk briefly about, to give you a taste of a recent paper that we did on the role of trauma stress reactions. So trauma, is something we see prevalently in our population group, kind of by definition, right? And trauma is like the intense emotional reaction to life events, negative life events. And trauma stress reactions are like protective behaviors that a person might take in response to trauma. So for example, a very common trauma stress reaction that we see is hypervigilance. And this is the idea that in the physical world, you're constantly scanning the environment for threat, right? And that's if it's not debilitating, that's a protective behavior, right? Because you've been abused and you should, it's protective to be trying to on the lookout for threat. In the technology ecosystem, we see a lot of hypervigilance with the technology, right? So, I have clients who ask me like, oh, I see on my emails is this vertical line next to some portions of the email, right? And does that mean he has access to read my emails? And after a few back and forths, like, what are you talking about? And we figure out like, oh, you're talking about the, the reply. When you do a reply, it often draws a vertical line and indents, right, to try to signify which is the previous email. But you can kind of almost see like, well, it said someone read the email, right, in the documentation for that, so you can see where they're coming from. But that's an example of hypervigilance. I see lots of examples. More broadly, when we sit down with a client, right, we may get kind of an opening statement that is something, and is a little shorter than usual, but something like this, right? They've been watching everything I do online and hacking all my devices and new ones that I just bought. It's a very common distillation of a type of thing a client might say at the beginning of an appointment. And this could mean all sorts of things, right? It could mean that the abuser does have access and is watching stuff they're doing online, perhaps via typical means, like an account compromise, right? If they have access to your Google account, they'll see your browsing history, right? It might mean that they're being hypervigilant, right? And that they are having, their previous experience with tech abuse is informing their behavior now. It could be that, indeed, there's like some nation-state level hacking operation going on that has compromised all the devices, including new ones, right? This is not something that we see in our clinic based on our thing. We've had maybe one client who we had plausible reason to believe, could have been targeted by a government because they were like someone who had been a political activist in their home country, and then we referred them out to another organization for help. But this is not the typical situation. And we don't have no idea whether they actually were a target or not. We referred them to someone who had a bit more expertise than that. Finally, the client could be suffering from mental health challenges, right? It could be that they are having delusions or psychosis, right? Of course, we're not mental health professionals. We're not there to help them with this. We're here to help with tech abuse, and we're not qualified anyway to diagnose this type of stuff. Final point, these are not mutually exclusive, right? All these things are actually likely to co-occur, not all of them necessarily, but some subset of them, right? It's very typical to have hypervigilant people. You may be having mental health challenges and have tech abuse happening against you. etc. So we wanted to understand this. It was kind of a sticking point challenge in clinic delivery that we kept having clients where, even the consultants were kind of like, I'm not sure what to think about this case. I don't know where it falls on that kind of like, set. And being client-centered and trauma-informed, I don't want to say this person was crazy, right? Like that's not what we should be doing. That's problematic in so many ways. But we still needed better guidance, I think, for our volunteers about how to try to handle these situations. Because we did want to make sure we're routing the people to the best possible support, right? If we think they need mental health support, well, it's not really for us to decide, but it could be that the tech abuse help is not helpful because it could feed into delusions, right? It's a tough judgment call to make. So we did a structured study where we interviewed consultants to kind of like more systematize our understanding of the challenges people were seeing. And at this point, we were able to do it across a few different clinics that had been set up across the country. And then do transcript analysis with the help of people who are actual subject matter experts with mental health to like read through transcripts and kind of code them for, examples of trauma stress reactions, maybe like the ways consultants replied to these situations and interact in these situations. And then we're able to like iterate basically on our protocol to provide slightly more guidance to consultants about various things you can do at various stages to try to ameliorate these challenges, right? So, doing a lot of expectation setting can be very helpful. Focused listening, which means compassionate interruption. Often we get like people just go on monologues for like 15 minutes if you don't interrupt, right? About all the situations they haven't made, move off from tech abuse into physical or other types of abuse as well. And it can be actually helpful to clients to like interrupt them and try to get back on track, et cetera. And basically flesh out a little bit the protocol to provide a bit more structure as we train our volunteers to help with these issues. Okay, so recall from before, right? Like the scale of IPV is sadly very large. Our kind of anecdotal sense is that most IPV situations involve some amount of tech abuse. And of course, we'd like to scale up as much as we can. We wrote a guidebook, basically a little textbook about setting up these type of clinics, and made it freely available online. There's a few other clinics, as I mentioned. Actually, the tech one was founded about the same time. We really got in touch with these early on. Have been collaborating ever since. And then one of my former students set up one in Madison. And actually, before I get into other population groups, like, we've been, working, like, there was some legislation on the table with the federal government in the US, like, set up funding for pilot programs across the country. Didn't pass, unfortunately, but that was last year. And we've been working to try and get resources, basically, to kind of provide more nationwide service. We've been focused very much heads down on IPV, but our hypothesis and strong belief is that this type of clinical intervention approach would be very helpful for many other types of at-risk populations. We just recently did a study on human trafficking, with human trafficking being a very close relative in some cases to IPV because the intimate partner may be the trafficker. But there's lots of other abuse settings, right? And actually, I'll talk about this very briefly at the end, but like my sense is that as technology gets more and more embedded in our daily lives, right, we kind of need to professionalize this idea of a tech abuse support professional, right? Someone who can help you navigate these things. Just like when you have legal problems, you get referred to a lawyer, a personal attorney, right? You have health problems, you go to a doctor. If you have tech abuse, you're under attack for whatever reason because of your life situation, you have a resource, someone who's an expert who can help you navigate that situation. Okay, so good. So so that's the first part of the talk. Maybe I'll stop and ask for questions because I know I should have said please interrupt for questions earlier, and I just kept babbling at you for 40 minutes. So if there's any questions now before we get into the kind of second half of stuff, happy to take them. Yes.
Thanks, really interesting talk so far. I was wondering about the volunteers you have for
Yeah.
your clinics. How do you recruit them? Are they former students of yours, or how does that process work?
Yeah, it's a mix of things. I mean, early on it was our PhD students and me and Nikki, my collaborator on all this. And then we started doing recruitment drives for volunteers, usually once, in a couple cases twice a year. We would advertise to students. So I'd say the bulk of our, actually, So there's basically a few demographics. There's like students, technical students typically, but not always, who are interested. And we recruit people from all backgrounds. Everyone has something interesting to bring. We can teach them about the technology stuff. Also professionals, a lot of people like work at Google and stuff who want to like do something with their time outside of work, use their expertise for something social good. I guess is the other main demographic. So it's mostly students and professionals. Some government employees and stuff too. But yeah, we do an interview process where we try to flag, doing red flags, right? And we talked a lot to and this has been kind of key to the, if I may, success of the work is being very well embedded in the IPv support ecosystem. There's a lot of expertise there about how to navigate these types of issues, right? Like how do you screen out potential abusive mindset people, or like, actually more often what we get is people who have experienced IPv abuse themselves that want to volunteer, but maybe aren't in like a place where we feel like that's going to be helpful for everybody. So we do an interview process, then we do a training process where we run them, but then we had to design all this stuff from scratch, like do a training process where we train them on IPv, we train them on the tech abuse that we see there, we train them on our protocols, et cetera. And then we have kind of an on the job, it's not a job because they're not getting paid, but they kind of shadow calls for a while and then get upgraded to someone who can like talk during the calls, and then they become a case lead, et cetera. So, yeah. Other questions? Yes? Yeah.
The spyware/malware, how sophisticated are they?
Yeah.
Because sophisticated malware, right, would use CVEs and stuff like that. And I would think that probably is not at that level.
No, it's not. Yeah, so I think there's like, when we think about nation-state spyware, like NSO Group, Pegasus, and these things, it's a different ball of different can of worms, whatever. Yeah, so these are consumer apps that were designed to exploit, sometimes in clever ways, the existing APIs that like Android and Apple at the time were providing. Apple has locked down their phones and iOS so much that like spyware doesn't really exist at this type of spyware doesn't really exist anymore in the Apple ecosystem. Instead, what happens with Apple is that you download something on the abuser's phone and then feed in the iCloud credentials for the target. And then it just downloads backups from iCloud from the phone, and you can kind of monitor remotely there. But yeah, they're much less sophisticated. There's been some follow-up work by other groups, like looking more detailed reverse engineering of these things. We did a little bit ourselves too. Sometimes they're doing clever things, but it's not like doing zero-day remote access stuff. You have to have access to the device. You have to install it.
That would mean that there should be reasonable technical mitigations.
Yeah, in fact, they've already been deployed. Apple shut down these things, right? You just lock down the operating system, and it's good. Actually, we don't see a lot of spyware in the ecosystem anymore. I think account compromise is a much more pressing issue, actually, per capita. And it's interesting because, like, we really focus in on things like spyware. We did it too. Like, it's like, oh, I understand spyware. That's like something tangible. I understand malware, and get focused on that. But that's often not the bulk of the issues, and I'll come to this point more in the next phase. Yeah. Yeah.
Or does it depend a lot on individual expertise?
So it's evolved over the last many years. One, we don't even use a scanning tool anymore. We're remote. We actually just work with them to like understand what apps are installed on their device, and also checking if like things like managed device mode is turned on for the phone, which again reflects the fact that like and the version of the operating system. If it's a very old iOS version, it could be jailbroken. If it's not, it can't be jailbroken. Right, like they've done a very good job of making it so you can only do untethered. You only can do tethered things. So if they reboot, it's fine. So originally it was, and this is kind of part of the key thing, is like originally it was a list. We didn't care as much about false positives because you were doing it in the room with the CS grad student or me. Sometimes I like to think of myself as a grad student still. And we can help interpret the results, and also ask the client, like, did you install Life 360 on your phone? Life 360 is a very well-known dual-use app that's for family safety. It's advertised for family safety. As far as I'm aware, they actually are trying to make it just for family safety. It's not trying to be covert, but that is also used for abuse, so it gets flagged a lot. But then we can ask them in the context. And we still do that now, just with the manual effort. great questions. Okay, so, oh yeah, one more. No, thank you. Yeah, it's beautiful. I had some good hawker food last night. Yeah.
One of the related question is actually I feel that you can see over the years the security community is actually expanding.
Yep.
And there's a multiple disciplinary research.
Yep.
And also we are reaching the social science part.
Yep.
Because the technical has
Yep.
responsibility. Then by that there are actually two angles. Right? One is that what's this mean for social science study? That means the security technique become a plugin data generator or context for the social science problem. The other view is that for security researchers, the social science is a context of plugin for all problems. Actually, the two directions have different approaches. I'm asking this question is maybe some suggestion for the new students because they are graduating in their career, want to see the horizon expanding. And this is a very impressive line of work. I feel that how I believe this first part is belongs to the social science domain. Then for any researcher or student who want to expand to this domain, what's your experience in talking to this group of people, adopting their doctrine to security research?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think one is always have to be careful about bucketizing topics. I mean, I think we all do this, and to some degree we kind of have to think about disciplinary boundaries. I feel like this clinical computer security stuff is a core computer security topic, right? Something that computer scientists should be involved in. And I'll try to make that case a little bit in the second half of the work. Like, it's changed how I think about doing mechanism design and cryptography and stuff, right? At the same time, of course, we have tons to learn from the social work world, right? And we collaborate with people from the social work world a lot. They have a lot of expertise in this ecosystem of abuse dynamics. I learned so much over the last 10 years. I think from the CS side, right, like the closest analog is like usable security type work where you're doing human-facing work. Now, this isn't quite usable security. Usable security focuses on in the security realm, basically how do nation-state actors trick you into giving them access to your digital assets, right? So it's still in that same mold and very important line of work. But in terms of methodological techniques, it's closer, right? Because we're doing a lot of human-facing work, qualitative methods, et cetera. So I think for students who are interested in this space, that's the closest adjacent one. There is a burgeoning community of people who work on these at-risk population topics. I'm happy to talk afterwards with any students who are interested in this space to give them suggestions about pointers. Yeah, that's a great question. Okay, so let's move on to some of and I think I have 30 minutes, but I'll try to leave some time for questions. So I'll probably only talk about one of these two things. But basically, all this work has, impacted how I think about computer security stuff. So let's talk about that a bit, and more on the technical side as well. So we get these accounts that, they're hacking into everything, right? When I think of hacking, or when I thought of hacking before this work, I think of things like remote code execution, privilege escalation vulnerabilities, like jailbreaking, and products like NSO Pegasus, et cetera. And of course, that's not really what people mean when they mean hacking, or that's not the techniques that are being used in this ecosystem. And I like to visualize this as this kind of inverted pyramid of what I call the tech abuse inverted pyramid, if you want to sound fancy. So basically, and it's basically going, as you go down, the technical sophistication is going up, right? And as you go up, the prevalence per capita, at least in the populations we've been seeing, and I conjecture across the world, is going up. That's anecdotal. We don't have great quantitative numbers on this, but this is my experience. This is speaking from my experience. So at the very top, we have remote abuse, right? You don't need any privileged access to the target. You just need their phone number to send them hundreds of text messages a night, right? Or NCII, you just need access to the image that was shared with you previously, privately. Account compromise, we already discussed. We'll discuss more about that with knowing the partner's password. Then you get down to consumer tools. You go online, find that spy cam, teddy bear spy cam that's advertised on Amazon.com, the hidden camera, and then put it in the apartment, right? And just set it up. It's designed for consumer use. And then we get a little bit more sophisticated, what I call reconfiguration adversaries. People who are technically sophisticated enough to do things like maybe monitor the Wi-Fi network. That's actually pretty complicated to set up, right? You need to have some IT background. But is still something that the tools allow you to do. And then you get to everything else, which is the bulk of computer security research, which I just call fancy stuff, right, from this perspective. Not saying this stuff isn't important. It is very important. Okay, so why aren't our security mechanisms working if the technical sophistication of these attacks isn't high? Well, to kind of at risk of belaboring the point, right, when we build our mechanisms for these kind of like fancy stuff threat models, right, we're probably missing kind of issues that come up in these interpersonal abuse settings, okay? These known adversary threats. So as we think about revisiting stuff, our computer security tooling for the latter, it's good to have a couple goals in mind, I think, that I've been using to guide our work here. So one, we do want to do this revisiting and have our security tooling informed by experience of tech abuse survivors, right? It's kind of quintessential to making progress towards mitigating abuse, tech abuse in their experiences. We do want to not just, we do want to focus on UI-bound, less technically sophisticated adversaries, but we don't want to just focus on them, right? Like, that's super important. It's, like, very widespread, so thinking about things at the user interface level. But we don't want to give up on more technically sophisticated adversaries, right? We want to provide security for in these interpersonal conflicts against even, when your partner is a computer security researcher, for example. So that's going to be important to keep in mind as well. So we want to go as deep down that technical stack as we can to provide protections for people. And then secondly, there are other threat models out there. Right? I'm not trying to say that like nation-state monitoring doesn't exist. Obviously it exists, right? And what we'll see is a lot of interesting tensions arise when we have to think about how to revisit things for different threat models that may have slightly mutually, seemingly at odds goals, right? So we'd like to achieve security for all threat models if at all possible. So let's just look at this in the context of account security, right? Like, to oversimplify somewhat, how do we authenticate to accounts these days? Most of us are still using passwords routinely, and I think we will be until at least I'm moved on from this world. I don't think passwords are ever going away. We have been making progress on deploying other ways of doing authentication, like passkeys and stuff. We have some work on that too I can talk about offline. But mostly, still either just password matching that lets you log in, or sometimes you need 2FA now. We've been doing a good job getting consumer products even to like adopt 2FA by mandates from Google and others. And so in the nation state kind of world, like actually one of the biggest threats and something I did a lot of work on is something very simple, actually, which is what's called credential stuffing attacks, right? Hackers on underground markets get access, or nation states or whoever, criminals, get access to a bunch of disclosed username password pairs. And there's literally billions and billions and billions of these, and when we were doing this research, we had lots and lots of usernames and passwords on our computers, including mine. One of my Skype account was in one of these breaches, which explained why it got compromised, and then the fraudsters started spamming porn links out to all of my contacts. It was very embarrassing as a researcher. I wasn't using Skype anymore even. Anyway, so what do? They just take these passwords and try them on other services, right? And this works, simulation suggests works 40% of the time. You know why? People reuse passwords, right, across different websites. And so this is actually one of the major sources of traditional kind of account compromise, right? So when you think about improving authentication for this ecosystem, which we did a bunch of work on, just very briefly, what's been the big move in this ecosystem, just for this as a slight digression, is password breach alerting has been something that's been deployed broadly. If attackers can get access to these username password pairs, so can defenders. And so let's just look up if someone picks a username password for my site that is on one of these breaches, I should warn them about it or not allow them to use that password, right? And there's some interesting privacy questions there, because if you have a third-party service, you don't really want to send your users' passwords to those services, right? So you need some cryptographic fancy stuff to deal with that. I'm not going to talk about it in detail. And there's some variants of credential stuffing where you don't just submit the password as is, but you add a 1 to the end of the password and submit that as well, right? Why? Because a lot of people add a 1 to the end of their password, as it turns out, et cetera. And then you can also think about guessing attack detection, detecting stuff, et cetera. So anyway, point being, a lot of work on improving authentication for these kind of classic security threats. When we think about known adversary, right, they don't need to do a credential stuffing attack, right? They often just know the password from the ecosystem. And we hear routinely about, them being able to circumvent 2FA, right? A classic issue that comes up is you'll have shared custody of children. Children will have an iPad or something that goes back and forth between the two homes. And when you do a login to an Apple account, what does it do? It blasts the 2FA out to all devices registered to that account, right? Including the child's device, so when it's in the abuser's home, et cetera. So, or, if someone's asleep, more simply, pick up the phone if you can get into it, et cetera. Yeah.
Yeah, just a quick one.
Yeah.
Increasingly, we have face authentication on phones.
Yeah.
And so how do they circumvent that? I understand that you can give away your password pretty easily to your family members.
Yeah.
But how do you give away your face?
You don't necessarily need to. There was a great antidote. I think they fixed this, but early on, the first versions of Face ID, you could hold up to someone who was asleep, and it would unlock, right? So they did, I think, try to build sleeping detection capabilities in, so they may have fixed that. I haven't heard any issues about that. 2, you can just compel access at some point, or when the relationship is in a slightly better place, why don't we just both have our faces for this phone, right? And so those emotional manipulation, coercion tactics may arise, right? For some people, it might be a good safety measure, and it's sufficient. But for some people, it won't be. Yeah, it's a great question. Same thing with fingerprints. It's actually you can add fingerprints to a device, right? So if you can get access to it, you can add fingerprints. It doesn't show anything about whose fingerprint it is, right? It's just the other person's fingerprint. Something we constantly check.
It's kind of very interesting because maybe you mentioned that the adversary basically becomes benign and good, benign and malicious over time, right? I'm trusting you to do honest things, so I give you everything. You can impersonate me.
Yeah.
And at some point, I lose that trust.
Yeah.
It's that threat model.
Yeah, very
You're
complicated.
saying there's any answer in this threat model?
Well, we're going to think about it from a detection perspective, and that's really what we're seeing, right? It should be useful. So yeah, detection is going to be the main thing. And basically, I think my point, and actually it's a great segue, is that, basically the point here is that actually in some cases, not all, in some cases we're never going to prevent, authentication is never going to be a surefire solution, right? There's going to be some people who can get into accounts, right? So that makes us think, authentication is not going to be a good wall, and we need to think about other approaches. And so we'll get to the detection part. Basically, we've been working backwards from clinic practice, what we see in clinic, and what seems to be the desires and goals of both the consultants and working with the survivors, to actually what we really need is better detection tools and forensic-y kind of viewpoint on who's been accessing accounts and when and from where. And then we'll see that those things have security problems. And that's because of traditional threat models. And there's a big tension there that we'll try to deal with. Okay, so this is, just a, yeah. Mm-hmm.
So you showed this pyramid.
Yeah.
So I would say that the technical solution probably might need to work more at the simple threats.
Yeah.
And not the complicated threats.
Yeah. Yeah.
The simple threats might be more. This is different. I don't think people focus much on those ones.
Well, I think logging into someone's account because you have access or trick them into giving is simple, so that's technically simple. The question of how far down the stack we want to go in terms of providing protections is something we'll come back to.
Media stuff might be different.
Yeah, I mean, yeah. So we're being, of course, as researchers, opportunistic about what projects we think we can make headway on. The other whole line of work was on social media harassment, but I'm not going to have time to talk about it. And I would encourage more people to think about this because obviously I feel like we've constantly been bandwidth constrained. We can't work on all. There's a lot of problems here, right? So I think we need a lot more people working on these known adversary threat model type things, to try to make progress because there are a lot of issues. Okay, so what this quote from this client is talking about is hey, and this is as a result of a consultation where we guided this client to there is this interface on Facebook that kind of shows where you're logged in, right? From. And, it shows a bunch of devices, and we started calling these accounts security interfaces. You may also get notifications to your email. In clinic, it's often easier to go straight to the thing than sometimes they don't have access to their emails anymore, or they have to search through it. It's complicated. So they tend to rely very heavily, both the consultants and the clients, on visibility into who and when is accessing their accounts. So one question we have been pursuing is how good are the kind of logging mechanisms available to users on accounts online? And so we did a measurement study to try and understand account security interfaces at a bit broader scale than kind of the common ones that we see most often. So we picked like 100 popular services that support accounts. We basically designed this semi-manual protocol where a researcher sits down, sets up an account on that service, a test account, looks for ASIs, tries to find out, do they have mechanisms for notifying you of when logins occurred, either via email or on a web page. We then do an adversarial kind of perspective on this where we kind of do some spoofing stuff. I'll talk about that in a second, where, to test the functionality. Log in from a different device, right? And then log out, log in again, set up some sessions, go back to the victim device, the simulated victim device, and check, what's going on in these ASIs, right? Did they actually log the logins that we had? The results are a little bit not great in the sense that like a lot of servers, like almost a third of the services don't have any notifications whatsoever anywhere on their service that we could find, right? And we spent a bunch of time looking for logs or notifications, right? So there's just no information at all. So things like Facebook are actually been very proactive, and Google and Apple have been pretty proactive on trying to provide information to users. For many other services, they have very inconsistent and or incomplete logging, right? Like we would see different numbers of sessions than we would expect. Sometimes more than you would expect, sometimes less, right? Or inconsistent information across different things, as I'll show next slide. And then the spoofable thing was pretty prevalent too, as I'll explain in a second. So you might not be able to read all this. This is an example of a walkthrough of Twitter/X's security settings. You kind of like go to, oops, is that working? Oh, it doesn't show up there. You go up to the top left. You have to go to more. And then you get security and privacy, then security and account access, and then, what's the next one? Apps and sessions. And then you get a list of things. There's one called sessions, one called account access history, and one called logged in devices and apps. And this is showing the 3 different screens that you get from those. One of them, fortunately, I guess, has some information about active sessions logged in from our measurements. Shows like a Windows, a Mac, another Mac thing. The account access history is empty. Right? The logged in devices and apps are empty as well, right? So there's inconsistent information being shown across these. If you read this text, it's just like nonsense. I don't even understand what they're talking about, right? I think this is some weird, maybe it's a vestigial feature when they have like different apps installed or some settings in some other part of the app, and then they list things relevant to that. It's very confusing, even to the research. We don't really understand what they're doing. So it's very inconsistent. It shows no access history at all, so none of the historical access is there. So as an adversary, you can just log out, and then your history is gone, right? The fact that you access the account from your device is gone. The other issue is this issue of spoofing, which I keep talking about, which I find fascinating as a computer security person. So what's going on here, right? Well, to populate this ASI, right, with information about where you logged in from, the question is where the service is getting that information, right? And where they're getting it is from HTTP kind of protocol and IP, HTTP/IP protocol stuff, right? Most of the information about what device that you're using is from what's called the user agent string, HTTP user agent string. It's this thing here, which is the browser telling the web service, hey, I'm a Macintosh, Intel Mac OS X thing, blah, 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 right? And that's coming from the client side. It also turns out that if you go into Chrome or Firefox, or I believe Safari as well, there's a way you can reconfigure the user agent string on the client browser, right? It's like in the development tools for Chrome. Now, this is not every adversary, and we don't think many users are doing this, but it's still UI bound in the technical sense that you can do this using the affordances provided by Chrome, but you have to be pretty sophisticated to even know what a user agent string is and how that impacts these things, right? You can also, even more simply, just change your location, right? How? You just go get a consumer VPN and choose a location, right? Because they're using the IP address of the client device to geolocate. Okay, so an adversary can just, change that up there. Now it's BB10, if you notice. And that changes what, oops, is this doing it? Ah, there we go. It's changing what shows up in the, okay, not in real time, but if they had done that, it would have shown up as BlackBerry instead. And in fact, all these things are spoofed, these things, right? So you basically have direct adversarial control over the information being shown in the log to the person who's trying to assess compromise, right? Which is a security 101 no-no. Okay, so, we'd like, admittedly, this is a little bit more sophisticated attack, right? Like you have to go figure out how to do this stuff. But we don't want to give up on these types of attacks for IPv survivors. And so you want to ask the question, like, why aren't we just providing more trustworthy information? Like, at least the operating system of the browser could like enforce sending proper information and not let you change this information. The backdrop of like why it's set up this way is because of a whole competing tension adversarial threat model, a more traditional privacy threat model, which is device fingerprinting. Basically, the web architects have been working very hard over the last 30 years, to prevent HTTP requests from being linkable to the same physical device. Why? Because if they allow that, then services like Facebook will use that for advertisement, for targeted advertising, and it's considered a privacy problem. So on one hand, on the left, we've been architecting the web to try and make it harder to link accessees to online services to particular devices. Right? On the other hand, we have, in these interpersonal settings and many others, the concern that like I want to know who's accessing my account, right? And this tension seems a priori like it may be fundamental, right? Like either the computer tells the service, here's my device information, here's the serial number of the device, or it doesn't, right? So now this provides an interesting research question, like can we navigate this tension, right? And so we've been exploring that. I got like 10 more minutes, right? Okay, I think we're running out of time. That's good. So we've been exploring using cryptography to like try to navigate this tension, right? And the basic insight is like, hey, well, for this ASI use case, the service doesn't need to know the device information, right? Just the endpoints need to know the device information, right? That's not true of all security issues that could benefit from better device tracking, but for this one it is. So we can try to use end-to-end encryption, and I do a lot of cryptography work, so there's no surprise perhaps that I thought, oh, maybe we can treat this as an end-to-end encryption problem, where we basically try to encrypt this device information, have encrypted logs that get sent back and forth between authenticated instances of the client software. But there's a bunch of challenges here in terms of like trying to figure out how to navigate this privacy, access, visibility trade-offs, how we would architect this more broadly. And we've just started thinking about this. We have one paper that's about to appear, or will appear next year, starting to think about just the cryptographic protocols. There's a lot of other challenges that I'll just briefly mention. Okay, so what's the basic idea of encrypted access logging? So, when we log in, we'll also have if you succeed in logging in to the login server, the server will accept from you some encrypted logging information. So just some device one just stand in for some unique identifier, say serial number or some other information. And we'll also generate public key, secret key pairs for that device so that others' devices can basically communicate back information encrypted to them. When someone else, another device logs in, or another session more specifically is generated on a different device, again, you log in and you can fetch right away this like encrypted log entry, right? As well as the public key information of the first device. At the same time, you'll generate your own key pairs, right? This is just classic public key exchange happening. Encrypt the actual keys are like symmetric keys in the public key secret pairs. You'll actually encrypt the regular symmetric secret key to the other session, right? To the other device, so that they can decrypt. Send that stuff over. Next time you access login service, you can get this information, and then you can complete the flow in the backwards direction, right? What have we done? We've just done a key exchange where like basically between these different devices and one per session, you're going to do key exchange to basically allow you to communicate privately through the service, okay? Benefit is that we can bootstrap off the same infrastructure. We don't have to contact a third-party service. You could do it as a third-party service. It would be, many of the same problems would arise that I'll mention in a sec. Okay, clear enough? We're going to encrypt stuff at the endpoints, get keys to each other somehow, and go from there. Okay, now there's a bunch of issues that come up with visibility, right? Like say I just log out at this point after doing some stuff on the session and never come back, right? Then none of this information ever gets to the destination, the other client, and in fact, you'll never be able to decrypt this device one log, right? Which happened in that session. So there seems to be some fundamental limits on what we can achieve when you want privacy from the server. And so, and this is the kind of informal version of this privacy integrity or like correctness kind of trade-off, where no private scheme can ensure that every session's access information is available to all sessions. Okay, there's going to be a limit. Which begs the question, like, can we maximize the amount of visibility into access information like that you can get, and what's the best possible? So to highlight one other issue here, if we have a second, say we log out explicitly of our session on this first device, and then later log back in from that same device, it would be attractive to use the same public key information, right? As in the first session, right? It'd be like kind of lower our burdens of key management and stuff. But remember, we have that competing threat model where we don't want to be revealing to services when you're logging in from the same device across two different sessions. And so that would create an easy way of linking these two sessions as being from the same device. So instead, we have to pick a new key, make it look like a fresh session, even though we're on the same device, and proceed from there. And there's a whole bunch of other issues, like we are on the same device, so in fact we do have access to that purple key, right? And we would like to tell the other user about that purple key so they can decrypt the original access log. So we'd like to send it to them. But we need to be very careful here that when we start sending encrypted information, and even the number of like ciphertexts we send, the number of encryptions we send, needs to look the same whether or not you're on the same device or not. So we have this like smuggling kind of idea that just makes this stuff indistinguishable. And therefore, and we conjecture maximizes the number of sessions, or more technically, the number of complete transcripts, like any ordering of sessions across different devices that other devices have visibility into all those account encrypted device logs. Okay. Anyway, so in this forthcoming paper, we'll have this, full protocol that we conjecture. We're working on the proof. I'm pretty sure it actually is maximal. Like we've achieved the best possible information flow because basically it's like as long as you have a round trip between any two physical devices, you should be able to get the information. But we're still working on that part of the proof. There's a lot of other challenges, right? Like to actually realize this, we would need operating system support because it's actually not enough for the browsers don't actually have serial numbers. And apps don't have serial numbers of the devices because the operating systems restrict apps from having access to that because they don't even trust the apps with this information, right? Because if it's the Facebook app, you can't trust Facebook's app with the serial number, just to pick on Facebook for the moment. So really we need something a little bit more FIDO2-y style where you'd have an operating system server that's helping with some of this stuff. It gets a little bit complicated. People who do cryptography or will note that I didn't talk about like how do we authenticate which public keys we're using in this thing. So there's a whole question of how you deal with malicious servers that are actively malicious, manipulating stuff as you go through. And then there's even bigger issue, I think, in terms of like how we do abusability and usability analysis here, right? Like what do we put into these device logs to be useful to users is still quite a bit of an open question. And note, there's a competing tension there. The abuser is also going to see this information, right? By symmetry. We don't know who the abuser is, which sessions are abusive. In general, our thinking is that more refined information is going to be mostly advantageous to victims because the abuser already has access to this information if they want from other means. But we need to do user studies, etc. Yeah, please.
In that spirit, would it perhaps be okay to time release that login information? Because you assume it's not sensitive enough to see.
Yeah, it's an interesting question. Like time release, like wait for a while to release it? Yeah, that's a good idea. I haven't thought about that. But yeah, basically, so it doesn't allow real-time stalking, but is useful for forensics later on. Yeah, it's a great question. Yeah, or a great idea. And then begs the question of like figuring out how to like answer it, like talking to professionals or survivors about it. Yeah, very nice. Cool. So just very briefly, very briefly with the next 20 slides. I knew I was probably going to get to this. It's all good. I'll just skip it. If you want to talk about how to do cryptographically secure abuse reporting, like harassment reporting in encrypted messaging, you can talk to me later. And just a few closing thoughts. Tech abuse of the ilk that we're seeing is already really widespread, unfortunately, and very complicated, and causes a lot of harm in the world. It's most likely going to get worse, is my sense. We're making pretty small progress, and we should work a lot more on this, on the abuser side of the equation. How do we cause desistance from tech abuse and other forms of abuse? But I'm skeptical that we'll make full progress on it. There's still going to be abusive mindsets out there. And then even more obviously, our dependence on digital technologies is growing, right? Like, I mean, this is kind of a trite thing to say. It's very obvious to everyone working in computer science, but like our day-to-day life, it's like getting harder and harder to function without safe access to your digital technologies, right? You can't find jobs. You literally can't find things because you need Google Maps to find stuff nowadays, et cetera. And so as we keep having these disruptive, and in most ways, in many ways, positive, improvements in how digital technologies get integrated in our daily lives, our dependence grows up, right? And so it becomes an increasingly powerful lever for coercive control type issues. So we need to, get ahead of thinking about more and more about these known adversary type threat models and really think about how this dependence is going to play out. So, and like with most things in the world, we kind of need both redesigning technology and our computer security mechanisms. And as a computer security person, I kind of dive in on those things. Obviously, we also need policies, right? Like, it probably shouldn't be allowed for you to go onto Walmart.com and buy like a hidden camera in a bathroom like towel hook, right? Like, and that is something you can just go buy on Amazon or Walmart right now. So we do need some policies to help tamp down these kind of bad actor ecosystems that people are monetizing abuse. And that's very tricky, and I'm not a policy expert, but I'd love to talk about more. We've made some progress in policy. There's some laws that we helped advocate for, but I can talk about that offline. I don't think we're going to succeed fully along these two things ever, which sounds pessimistic. I don't think that it's not meant to be. It's just like I think that's the reality, right? These things are very complicated. You're never going to have a technological solution for anything. You're never going to have a pure policy thing for anything. And so we need this type of interventional approach that inevitably people are going to have problems, right? And so this vision that I mentioned before, professionalizing tech abuse support, just like we have professional personal attorneys, we have personal incident response people for helping people with technology abuse, and we need to how is our business models here? How do you get paid, right? We often talk about just setting up private practice like tech abuse support, where we don't have to provide a free service, we could charge people for it, right? And educational and career pathways more broadly for this. And the goal being there that in 30 years, instead of having it be just a few small clinics trying to help with things, anyone, there's a lot of support, more support out there for people to get access to. All right, and with that, I will stop and answer any more questions, or happy to talk over lunch or during breaks. Thank you.
So I'm curious, you talked a lot about known adversary threat models. You mentioned threat model many times. Are there formalized threat models that we could, as technologists, address, or is this probably, it sounds like a lot of your talk is focused on how we can mitigate these problems, how we can mitigate a lot of the abuse that's happened through non-technology means. But are there things as technologists we can address, or are these indistinguishable? Because the obvious example is if I put a tracker on my wallet, it's obviously indistinguishable. Somebody steals my wallet versus I plant a tracker on them.
Yeah, fantastic example.
Are there threat models that we should be investigating in a
Great.
formal technology sense?
Great, yeah, so I think there are, right? I think on the account security thing, secure logging is as quintessential of a computer security threat model issue as you can imagine, right? In the 90s and 80s or whatever, right? Getting into a system, how do we make sure the logs actually have high integrity so that when the hacker gets in, they can't manipulate the logs? Classic kind of issue, just being seen at this higher level. The the AirTag kind of tracker thing is a fantastic example, because to me, this is one of these situations where we actually need to combine lots of things. First, I think we need to have policy that basically mandates that companies give up on anti-theft. And this is a hot take maybe, but I think the anti-theft marketing and threat models that they're doing there, we should just get rid of. Targeting. Because they kind of beget covertness by the tag from the person who it's with, and that is exactly seemingly symmetric to the stalking use case, right? So if you target anti-theft, this is a hypothesis, you target anti-theft, you necessarily enable stalking. Apple's actually shifted away from the anti-theft rhetoric already, and they've been building, and now it becomes so you regulate away the anti-theft thing, in an ideal world, if I had power. And then it becomes an interesting technical problem of like, how do we build discoverable IoT devices? And I think that's an interesting like technical question. Like we need protocols and standardization. Apple and Google have been doing a little bit of anti-stalking. I think we should go further and like basically all IoT should be discoverable. Like if you're in the physical proximity of a camera, you should be able to figure out that it's there. Now there are competing threat models with like, I know I'm throwing a lot of stuff at you because I've thought about this a lot. So we basically want to be discoverable. I should know like where IoT devices are in this room, right? If I want to and I need to by like using a phone or app, right? And maybe we can restrict it to particular things like that. You look skeptical, which is great.
So this is why,
Yeah.
especially as a security researcher, I'm asking what are the formalized threat models? Because
What do you mean by formal?
Assumes,
Yeah.
assume benevolence that the attacker is going to comply with these regulations.
No.
So an IoT device, if I hack an IoT device and just set a bit
Yeah.
on that configuration that says,
Yeah.
don't actually announce yourself.
Right.
And I have defeated all of them.
Right. So that's why we need the combination. Yeah, so right. So it's good. So there's the bad actors who are producing the devices, right? That are making them for abuse use cases, right? I don't think you're going to solve that technically, right? They're building like weapons, right? Or they're building things, right? Like we need other infrastructure for dealing with it. That's what I mean by the policy stuff. Once you have policy against that type of thing, then it turns into more of a security issue, like a traditional computer security problem of like, how do I prevent someone who buys my device turning it into this type of malicious software-based tracker, which is a classic operating systems, embedded systems challenge, right? And we can talk about what one means by a formal threat model and like how to articulate what we mean by a threat model there. But you have access to device, you can like put probes on it. You know, there's like tons of literature on this. And then there's the question of like, okay, now that we have devices that we think are secure, right, relative to those things, and we'll engage, participate in some type of protocol for discoverability, how do we design those protocols to make sure that we're not throwing other privacy risks under the bus, right? And there's been a lot of work on this and like beacon tracking and stuff. And like, I'm not saying it's easy. I'm not sure if it's even possible. But from my perspective, I think it's going to be a big problem. Like I just see it a lot, right? Like people need to be able to find IoT devices around them for lots of reasons. You go to an Airbnb, you want to know if there's hidden cameras there, right? You are in an IPv situation, it comes up all the time. You go to a bar and you leave the bar. And you don't want to have an AirTag in your purse or bag. Sorry, okay. Yeah, go ahead.
I was wondering more about the real-life mitigation process. I'm very curious. So, like, you know, typically what does happen? Suppose you find malware on somebody's phone or something like of the sort. What typically happens, and what is your ideal sort of visualization for what should happen?
So, like, if we discover like someone's logged into an account or like that becomes a conversation with the client about what they think they want to do. And usually we actually start that conversation by warning them not to do anything to start because of the escalation type risk. They may want to go through safety planning with their support professional who knows more about their situation. We kind of purposely built the service to stay in our lane, so to speak, that we're focusing on the tech. We don't know. We don't ask about histories of physical violence or like strangulation risks or like if there's a gun in the home, these type of other issues, right? So like safety planning is a big potential next step before you do anything. The other issue is forensics. A lot of people want legal evidence or some type of evidentiary value for court cases. A lot of family court, like custody battles, or trying to get orders of protection. So if you change stuff, maybe hard to get evidence. Evidence here is not complicated in general. It's like taking a screenshot of what you saw and trying to explain it. And that's a very important aspect of it too. Yeah. So, but it ends up being up to the client, and like no two clients are the same. There's some common categories of issues that come up, but that's why I think this personalized service type thing, when it's in a high risk situation, you really want. Yeah. I'll let Reza decide whether it's okay to take more questions. Yeah.
I like your example of comparing it to lawyers and doctors.
Yeah. Thank you.
These people come incredibly handy when the crisis has already happened.
Yeah.
And by that time, you already know that you're in trouble.
Yeah.
I'm wondering if you're suggesting that this is a problem of that type, where your photos have already been emailed out of your account. So a lot of the damage, both emotionally and reputationally, is already done.
Yeah. Yeah.
I'm wondering if this is the right vision. I mean, is this what we're trying to, do we want to advocate for this, or do we want to advocate
That's a great, yeah. So, I think we get a lot of clients who come in with concern about NCII, and the right thing that we should be doing is pressuring companies to actually respond to takedown requests for NCII. That would be the best immediate next step for that, because we can only do what the clients can do, which is go to like those abuse reporting things, click a button, and nothing happens. Literally nothing happens. Sorry, non-consensual intimate imagery. Yeah, people call it revenge porn, but that's kind of problematic connotation. So, so for certain classes of risk, like anything, incident response isn't like if the horses are out of the barn or whatever the right idiom is. It's only harm mitigation at the end. I think just like personal attorneys, like if you know that you are, like you go get, some people get personal attorneys proactively to help them navigate things ahead of time. I think you would imagine similar types of effects emerging from this professional class of tech abuse people, right? It doesn't have to just be incident response. It can also be advice, right? But, I don't have all the answers. I don't know. Like, it's a good question. I think we should be advocating for this. It's a very clear, palpable need. When we went and talked to professionals and we asked them, like, what would be the best thing computer scientists could do for this ecosystem? And they said, be involved. And that was it. Like, there's a huge, like, situation of history of legal profession doing pro bono work. So there's a lot of lawyers in these abuse settings. There's no technologists, formally trained technologists, right? Yeah. And it won't be exactly the same as like the other types of things we do in our day job. I'm not saying we should stop doing work on like formalization efforts or like whatever, right? Obviously those things are super important too. I'm just saying I think we need to expand the horizons of what we think of computer security entailing, and some of this human-facing, direct, personalized support, I think is a vision that is compelling. Obviously, I might be sipping from my own punch bowl, as the saying goes. And I'm happy to argue about this. I'm sorry, discuss this point offline. Yeah.
Maybe one question, if I may ask.
Sure. Yeah.
Does some of these problems come from the fact that you're moving to personal devices and personal accounts, where the assumption is that one user has access to all the content?
Oh, like having like single sign-on type. Yeah.
All days you had one computer, multiple people could log in, there were privileged, different access to different files. But now if I have access to my cloud account, all files could be accessed immediately.
Yeah. I mean, the flattening of like access control policy and the simplification that the web has kind of engendered, maybe it makes things more complicated. It seems qualitatively like the same problem, right? Like if you roll back to like the 80s and for the early adopters of like personal computing, probably there was abuse going on there too, right? Where they were exploiting joint access to the same physical computer, right? We see that with laptops now. So I think a good question, and I think this is actually a tough question that the web companies are focused on. Like, how do you manage multiple users? Like, you see things like with Netflix, right? Where it's like, oh, actually, we know most of our users have a multi-family unit. So we're going to set up profiles that you log into. It's the same authentication, but different profiles, right? So I think there's been some, it's a flat permission structure, and maybe that needs to change. It's unclear. But there's been some other good work on these kinds of things too, like how you do, think about account, access control stuff in multi-user, same account settings. It tends not to be on the adversarial side of the fence, but yeah. Yeah.
It's maybe more a remark, but for authentication, then the one approach is continuous authentication using some kind of thing, and that is much harder to fake. So that could solve the problem, but may not be so usable and may not be so transparent, and you may lock yourself out.
Yeah. I mean, we thought about
so that is one potential solution is the usability.
Yeah. It's a great observation. It's something we thought about, like when we first saw it. I was like, oh, one thing we could do is actually try to have services detect when it's two different users using the same account, right? Because you can easily imagine that there's behavioral tells that aren't necessarily it's like the complement. It's more like anomaly detection, right? Like so, if I log in and I suddenly go look at your Facebook profile through every single man, and you're a woman, right? Like maybe I'm not. That's not typical behavior by the usual user. We thought about that stuff, but we saw a more pressing concern that like the logging aspect was sort of like more immediate and it was clear to me there's issues there that we need to solve as well. So I think it would be a good direction to like understand like detection-based approaches, continuous authentication approaches. I think those things are complicated to get right, and inevitably they'll be fallible, right? Yeah, is my kind of take. That doesn't mean we shouldn't work on them and improve them. Like the authentication, there's always going to be some false positive rate, right? And we just need to deal with it. Thank you very much.